Ranking Member Durbin, President Biden is the President of the United States. He was duly sworn in, and he is the President of the United States. There was a peaceful transition of power. President Trump left office and was overwhelmingly elected in 2024.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. On May 29, 2010, Hungary was a flourishing democracy with a free press, strong civil liberties, an independent judiciary, and a multi-party political system. That day marked Viktor Orban's return to power as prime minister after a free and fair election driven by public outrage over the incumbent government's mishandling of the 2008 financial crisis. In his years out of power, Orban had cemented his control over Fidesz, molding it into a vehicle for his brand of right-wing populism. In short order, Orban's government, having commandeered the legal and political system, eviscerated judicial independence and installed a loyalist judiciary. It attacked and undermined the free press, enacted election laws that hugely advantaged Fidesz, and ended free and fair elections, labeled dissenters as foreign agents and restricted their activities, and overhauled the Constitution to centralize and consolidate power. 15 years later, Orban remains firmly entrenched, his rule sustained by these subversions of democracy, despite repeated condemnation from the European Union and the broader international community. Donald Trump, who returns to official power at noon today, has consistently expressed admiration for Orban as a, quote, tough and, quote, smart leader and a, quote, strong man. During his debate with Kamala Harris, Trump dismissed her claim that world leaders lacked respect for him, citing Orban as a counterexample and calling him, quote, one of the most respected men. Following Trump's election victory, the two leaders spoke by phone, with Orban declaring afterwards that they had, quote, big plans for the future. Then, just last month, Orban came to Mar-a-Lago to visit with Trump and Elon Musk. Trump will take his oath of office as president today, and if the past is prologue, he will be lying. In recent months, even before taking office, Trump has used strong-arm tactics to bring both houses of Congress to heel. He appears poised to reconstruct the government around the principle of loyalty to his personal interests and to punish any official who dares to defy him. As of today, America is a backsliding democracy. The pressing question now is whether various forms of resistance can slow the erosion and preserve enough of constitutional rule for it to recover when and if Trump's rule ends. To take the deepest of deep breaths and stare into the abyss of the inauguration for a second term of the most dangerous president in the nation's history, we are joined by three superb, seasoned commentators who have brought unparalleled wisdom and insights for many years. And they are Jonathan Alter, an award-winning author, filmmaker, columnist, MSNBC political analyst, and contributor to The Contrarian. What is that, you might say? Well, stick around for 2 minutes. His Substack is Old Goats, Ruminating with Friends, and his most recent book about the New York trial that we attended together is titled American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial. And my own, John, always a pleasure to welcome you, especially on such a pivotal day.
Thanks for having me.
Norm Eisen is a co-founder of The Contrarian. What is that, you say? Stick around for 90 seconds. A senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute and the founder and chair of the State Democracy Defenders Fund. He served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2020, including for the first impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. His most recent book is titled A Case for the American People, United States versus Donald J. Trump. Norm, a stalwart, always a pleasure to have you, especially on day one.
Harry, my brother.
Say no more. Jen Rubin, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of The Contrarian. What is that? Stick around for 60 seconds. MSNBC contributor and host of Jen Rubin's Green Room. Before launching The Contrarian, she spent over 14 years as a veteran opinion columnist at The Washington Post. She's the author of the book Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Always great to welcome you, and today more than ever.
It is great to be here, Harry. A fellow Bolt graduate is always my favorite host.
All right, let's begin with the biggest news of the week and year. Well, not really, but a pretty big splash in our little world, and that's the advent of a new Substack built for this moment under the leadership of Norm and Jen, with a dazzling, long, and diverse list of contributors, including John and me. I don't want to hijack the discussion, which we have a lot to talk about on day one of Trump 2.0. But if you, Jen, and you, Norm, could just give a short précis of why now and what you hope to achieve with this new project.
Democracy is at an inflection point. We are about to enter into the brave new world of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, the corporate billionaire media is not meeting the moment. What we're going to offer is unadulterated, unabashed, pro-democracy coverage of this administration and the events surrounding it. But we also understand that the way to fight autocracy involves more than law, more than politics. It involves culture. And part of the problem, I think, with the large D Democratic Party is that they've failed to reach a huge swath of the American public in the way the right has. They have Joe Rogan. They have a whole bunch of folks who relate to people who, frankly, aren't that political. Well, we think we need to do that too. So it's not just politics. It's not just law, although we have the best of both. But we are going to be offering newcomers, Olivia Giuliana, who is the TikToker. We're going to have cooking. We're going to have fashion. We're going to have sports. We're going to have music. We're going to give a whole panoply of...
Will there be any humor, though?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have Andy Borowitz, the Borowitz Report. We have an award-winning cartoonist in addition to that.
There you go.
And we're going to feature all day long on Monday. Our coverage of the inauguration is going to be humor, satire, mocking, because that's what this administration will deserve.
Norm Eisen.
Every once in a while, there's a tectonic shift in the media landscape. And I think with the decline of cable, so many of the billionaire owners of both old media like Bezos, but new media like Musk and Zuckerberg, all three of them were formerly champions in different ways, and they've become candidates for the American oligarch class. They'll be seated on the dais. That has created a kind of shift among the readership. And together with the decline of cable, we're in this moment. You saw Ben Shapiro was a leader, very different politics than ours. Barry Weiss moved in a similar moment, anti what she terms political correctness. She captured an audience, lightning in a bottle. Something happened very similar with Megyn Kelly. We thought her career was over when she washed out at NBC, bigger than ever. Tucker Carlson. What do those examples have in common? Even the Bulwark, which we admire, they're all center, right of center, far right. There is a huge appetite on the left that we have tapped this week. We now have more subscribers in just 4.5 days than the Washington Post lost in the big exodus. We have tapped this moment, and with this outpouring of contributors, including you and John, non-exclusive contributors, both of you keeping your own Substack, doing stuff for us. With this moment, there's a huge surge of people who want to be a part of that. And we have Andy Borowitz to do humor. And we have Marissa Rothkopf, who writes The Secret Life of Cookies, cooking with a sprinkle of democracy mixed in. And the youth movement, Olivia Giuliana, we published 5 or 6 TikTokers. She anthologized the TikTokers' view on TikTok for us this week. We were the only ones who did that. We're fast. We're first. We were the first to get up the Jack Smith essays. Jen and I stayed up all night. So we think it's the moment for this. We're going to do Substack, then we're going to move into YouTube, podcasting, and really try to build a new kind of a media project.
And hot off the presses, our own announcement about the Contrarian, which is that all paid subscribers to the Contrarian will also receive Patreon-level subscriptions to Talking Feds, including ad-free episodes and special content. Rest assured that we're the same independent podcast out of the same independent control as ever, for better or for worse, but I'm proud to put in with this important and necessary new project, as is John.
We are so thrilled to have you guys.
Welcome!
Welcome to the Mishpocha.
Mazel tov!
Google, gobble, we accept. All right. We published on day one of Trump's second term. It was a valedictory week for the Biden administration, which we want to talk a little bit about before moving on. So he had a farewell address, which was somewhat at cross purposes. He touted his accomplishments, which do seem to be dramatically undervalued as he leaves office, but that's for another day. But overall, it was this kind of somber mood, warning that America is teetering on the edge of becoming an oligarchy. What did you make of the tone and message? And I guess a follow-up question, to whom would you say the warning, such as it was directed? And let me start with John.
So this was in the spirit of what are only a few famous farewell addresses. The two most famous are George Washington's and Dwight Eisenhower's. And in Dwight Eisenhower's, of course, as President Biden mentioned, he warned against the military-industrial complex. And in Biden's, he warned against what he calls the tech-industrial complex. I'm not sure that industrial is the right 2025 word, but it resonates of Eisenhower in that sense, landed. And then when he went on to say things like, media in the United States is, quote, crumbling. You knew that this part of the speech would be historic. I think you can legitimately ask why he, waited this long before delivering this. You could ask the same of Eisenhower. Why did he wait till after a huge defense buildup before he warned of the military-industrial complex? But what it does do is it sets new parameters for important debates. And so the most important word that he used was not tech-industrial complex. I don't know whether that'll catch on or not, but oligarchy, which is a word that most Americans don't know, but can be taught what it means. And interestingly, I've just come through 2 weeks of basically wall-to-wall coverage of Jimmy Carter, because I wrote this biography of him that I spent the better part of 5 years of my life on. And Carter, who was elected as a moderate Democrat and actually was quite conservative on a number of issues, budget balance or a lot of other things, completely slimed by the Reaganites. But he didn't like to admit it too much, but he kind of was making his own journey to the left. And by 2016, he and his entire family were for Bernie Sanders against Hillary. And a lot of it was on this question of oligarchy. And that's a word that Carter used in our conversations. I think Democrats have to be careful in the way they apply this populist argument about oligarchy and the super rich, because we are such an aspirational nation, and populism hasn't really worked. It's never really given us a president. I don't think Donald Trump's fake populism was very relevant for his election and reelection. Most Americans want to be rich, so it's tricky how you deploy this. But I think by opening the conversation, Biden, who I'm still seriously pissed off at for running for reelection in the first place, he redeemed himself to a certain extent with this excellent farewell address.
I have a piece for Monday, and I looked back at a number of presidential inaugurations, and they all had this notion of putting the American people first. It was the 50 faces of ordinary Americans for Clinton. Obama recreated the famous train trip that Lincoln took to the Capitol. Even in 2021, Biden was extolling, if you will, the common man. And what do we get this time? We get a dais of 4 or 5 tech billionaires who have unprecedented power and influence. And what do we get in a cabinet? The wealthiest and least diverse cabinet we have ever had. So in some ways, we are entering a period where it's of by and for the billionaires. And I think it's not simply that they have wealth, more power to them. Everyone in America does want to get rich. But what they have is a stranglehold on power and democracy that it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the average person to rise up and to get their share of the pie. And it is this stranglehold on economic and political power that I think is so dangerous and ultimately is antithetical to the most basic concept that the government is responsible to the people, not to the few big billionaire donors, not to Donald Trump, not to some foreign power that is manipulating them, but to we the people. And we are entering really unprecedented territory.
I think that history is going to regard Biden right up until that unusual valedictory, in which in some ways, it's almost as if he's a passive victim of historical forces rather than someone who could have, through an early exit, made a difference. They're going to regard him as the best of presidents and the worst of presidents, because the economic performance that Biden stewarded in was extraordinary. And other world leaders and experts and nations look at America and they're like, oh my heavens, we are the envy of the world. However, he was defeated by the price of a carton of eggs and a quart of milk, among other factors. In my view, Kamala Harris was very narrowly chased out by those factors, and I evaluate her on a different set of metrics. I think she did amazingly given the short runway. So that such performance, but such weakness in communications, I did not think it was a particularly gripping moment, and the communications fell far short of the performance. That is actually, in this action-packed podcast, I will announce that at Brookings, we've just released the first major report by an American institution, scholarly institution, assessing that democracy is backsliding in America and saying what to do about it. And one of the most important things in this democracy playbook is you've got to make democracy deliver and communicate it. And that comms was a failure, a signal failure, and a very costly failure of the Biden administration. And I thought of his valedictory remarks.
I agree with that. I mean, all I kept thinking as I'm watching that speech is this guy never took a real look in the mirror. The idea of that Joe Biden being president 4 years from now, how frail and unable he was to deliver a speech. And he thought that 4 years from now, and his wife will go down in history as one of the worst first ladies we've ever had, because she wasn't looking out for her husband's true self-interest. And for whatever reason, she didn't tell him it was time to quit. And she needed to do that. And by the way, so did the Democratic Party establishment. I mean, I wrote a Substack piece in, I think it was late 2022, saying there should be an intervention. They should all have gone to the White House, including Steve Breyer. Say, look, I stepped down. You've been a great president, but you need to quit. And then I think basically there's a lot of people who need to admit that they didn't step up, including a lot of people in the press, that they didn't step up and recognize the reality.
I'm going to say something even more heretical. This is not the heretical thing. I don't know that I agree with that first ladies should be evaluated on those policy dimensions.
Norm, the consequences of him not getting out are horrible for this country.
They are. The heretical thing I want to say is that the disaster of our age is far more complex than just Trump. And of course, these considerations factored in. But the thing your analysis brought to mind was the other great failure, which was Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her violent reaction to Barack Obama's effort to get her. When you look at the razor's edge of the Supreme Court, that one seat is extremely consequential and will be perhaps for decades to come, given the youth movement among MAGA justices. Let me tell you, Thomas and Alito will not be so hesitant.
Yeah. I think Alito in particular, acting so outrageously, maybe is signaling he's going to go. The point Jen made, there are two ways in which both Trump and the tech world have taken us by surprise over the last couple of months. We were really attuned to all the threats for democracy, and that was our real focus. And, you know, there was this Elon Musk mascot figure dancing around but it's now there's been a real rush to Trump of all the big players giving millions in the inauguration. You know, I think of the tech industry as being the kind of rise of the dorks. I say that with affection, being one myself. But now we're potentially on the precipice of a new Gilded Age, and they are playing the oligarchs, and they're just looking like robber barons, it seems to me. And they're also such a bigger part of what Trump seems to be about.
Harry, you and I, and maybe Jen and Norm, we're technically nerds, not dorks.
Really, I stand corrected. It's an important distinction. All right, let's talk about the confirmation hearings we are, right in the middle of. There's a ton of rolling over going on here, right? That in the nation's highest deliberative body, that, Pete Hegseth looks as if he'll be confirmed, which in previous times would have been unthinkable, and a few weeks ago would have been a bad bet. Ernst, who just stands in here for someone who would dare to try to exercise independent judgment on an administration choice, and what befell her and how she, had to knuckle under. Man, this is a harbinger of his really having an unanticipated, to me anyway, level of success with his cabinet.
This is how authoritarians operate. You lose in the institutions around them any obligation to uphold your institutional responsibilities. So the Senate collapses. The courts are, in a large sense, collapsing. You lose any appreciation for expertise, for truth-telling. You lose a aversion to corruption and personal morality. So you get the worst of the worst, the sleaziest, the least competent, the least prepared people to go into positions of enormous power and influence. And these people simply go along. It is Viktor Orban's Hungary. This is how they operate, with a clique of toadies and equally corrupt, equally intellectually minimalist figures around them. And I think one aspect of this is it also involves a personal self-humiliation. And that's why the Joni Ernst thing was so important. She is a survivor of sexual violence. And she is going along with this guy who has been credibly accused. He denies it. I want to be clear about that. He denies it, of sexual misconduct. To do that is such an act of kind of self-destruction, of self-prostration at the altar of Donald Trump. It's almost painful to watch. And that is what we're experiencing. And you even have a few Democrats who are going to vote for these people. By the way, if my decision to leave the Washington Post was any question mark in my mind, their decision to give a thumbs up to people like Pam Bondi and Linda McMahon was all the reason we could see this is what an independent newspaper says. They're supporting, if you will, for Attorney General, an election denier who is involved in corrupt practices of Donald Trump's charity were now in the business of supporting the WWE executive for education secretary. That's the problem with capitulation, is it becomes this circle of reinforcing cronyism, kleptocracy, and a reduction in functional government. And that's what's so pathetic, so disturbing.
One thing that is behind this, and it makes Joni Ernst's case especially poignant since she was a victim of sexual violence, is the threat of future violence. And this is, again, how authoritarians roll. They don't actually have to commit the violence, but their people threaten the violence. So I recommend to you McKay Coppin's terrific book on Mitt Romney. McKay, who had been my intern years ago, really got inside Romney's head. He spent a tremendous amount of time with him. And Romney said that the reason that Trump was not convicted in the second impeachment trial, they just needed a few more Republicans, is that those colleagues were physically intimidated. They were worried for their physical safety. And while Romney, who's independently wealthy, had the money for 24-hour bodyguards, even other, fairly wealthy members of the Senate, that's a very expensive thing to have. And they felt unprotected. They don't get Secret Service protection. And they confided to Romney that they were afraid for their own safety. So you can only imagine the death threats that somebody like Joni Ernst is getting. And she obviously doesn't want to talk about them publicly. And the Trump people don't have to do any of this themselves. The mob that he unleashed on January 6th can do it for him. And he has sort of deniability on those threats of violence. Now, in terms of fighting back, because I think it's just sort of depressing for people listening, because they, once you get depressed and feel like you can't fight back, then you're really cooked. So people have to continue the fighting spirit. And it's one of the things that I like about the debut of the Contrarian. You have to pick your fights and where you fight back. And so I wouldn't have endorsed Linda McMahon, but I also wouldn't have put all my chips on trying to beat her. We've had plenty of cabinet members who've been worse in the past, including Trump's first Secretary of Education. She was Betsy DeVos. She was horrible. So you have to pick your fights. The question is, just very quickly, two things to fight on. One is on language. So right now, there's no language about these people. And I don't know if this is the right thing to call them, but I think they should be called knee benders.
Ring kissers.
Ring kissers. Maybe that ring kissers is better. Knee bender, ring kisser. Maybe you could do both of them. But every sentence about this should include either ring kisser or knee bender. And the world should basically be divided between those who are ring kissers and those who are not, so that you stigmatize those who are. As Orwell taught us in his great essay, Politics in the English Language, so much of this is about how you frame it. And Democrats have been so bad on this for so long. They just have to get better, and also stop leading with their chin, because when they do frame things, they frame it in ways that are suicidal, like defund the police or Latinx, right? So they just have to stop leading with their chins, and when they frame things, be it about their opponents. Then the other thing, which we don't have to discuss now, it's a much bigger topic where you lawyers are the experts, is I'm for giving the ring kissers and the people in government whose rings they're kissing a taste of their own medicine big time. Now, this is a strange thing to say for journalists, because normally I don't like, lost defamation suits, libel suits. And I don't think they should be directed at, the Steve Bannons of the world. But Kash Patel, if he's confirmed, and he's the worst, I think everybody's attention should be focused on Kash Patel, because he wants to create a secret police in the United States to do the king's bidding. But every time he opens his mouth to attack somebody, he should be slapped with a defamation suit and spend half of his time as Attorney General in depositions. Remember, look at E.G. Carroll. All Trump said about her was that she was a liar. And she won, what was it, $88 million? And by the way, under Paul Jones versus Clinton, which is still the law of the land, the people think because of the immunity decision that you can't sue the president. That's not true. It's just you can't prosecute the president under the immunity decision. You're still entirely free to sue him for things that he says, according to the Nixon versus Fitzgerald case, that are outside the perimeter of his official duties. So anytime these jokers open their mouths and attack people, they should be sued. And I'd be very interested to hear what you guys think about that.
Well, I think your analysis that Kash Patel is the single greatest threat is right. Remember also, he's got competition. Pam Bondi has said the prosecutor should be prosecuted and the investigator should be investigated. Back in her auditioning days, now she says, oh no, we won't have an enemies list, she said in her Senate hearing. Oh no, as if Kash Patel didn't literally have one in his book. She says, oh no, I never heard the January 2021 tape where Donald Trump says, can you find 11,780 votes? Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't heard the tape.
Oh, I never heard them referred to as hostages.
The mendacity. So she's bad, and Tulsi and RFK Jr. and Hedgeseth, they're all terrible. But Kash is singularly bad. And I say that coming again from an analytical perspective, having just finished this 170-page democracy playbook where we reviewed thousands of sources, we did field work, we consulted with people. Why did democracy never come back in Hungary but hang on in Poland or Brazil, have a return in Czech Republic where I was ambassador? One of the critical things there, you don't have to read all 170 pages. We boil it down to a chart. It's about 30 words. The 7 critical things, because John, as you say, you have to prioritize, right? The top 2 are protect elections and protect the rule of law, because by protecting elections, you can vote to oust the autocrats. By protecting the rule of law, you can hold them accountable in court, and prosecutors are not turned in and judges turned into weapons that crush the opposition. And there's 5 other very important emphases. And then we say there's 993 other things, I guess 994, because that makes 1,001. Forget the other 994, focus on those 7, 1 and 2 elections and rule of law. By that matrix, the most dangerous is Kash Patel because he's the most unprincipled. He'll have the most power. He has the enemies list. He has, unlike Bondi, who was like I fought her in the impeachment. She was opposing counsel. She's perfectly pleasant. She's thoroughly mediocre. She won't have a single new idea on how to persecute people. Kash Patel will have the power, the means, the motive, and totally subservient to Trump. He is the number 1 in this democracy matrix.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we dig up the dirt on the agave plant to find out the difference between tequila and mezcal. So first things first, tequila is a type of mezcal, much like bourbon is a type of whiskey. In general, tequilas are mezcals, but not all mezcals are tequilas. Allow me to explain. Tequila can only come from the blue agave plant in specific regions of Mexico, like the region of Jalisco, where the city of Tequila is located. No coincidence there. Mezcal, however, can be made from many varieties of agave, specifically from the heart of the agave, known as the piña. The distillery process for tequila and mezcal is also different. Tequila is produced by steaming the blue agave and then distilling it in copper stills for a toasty, clean taste. On the other hand, mezcal, which appropriately means oven-cooked agave, is cooked in earthen pits with wood and charcoal before being distilled in clay pots. No wonder mezcal, which is typically consumed straight, has more of a smoky, earthy taste Of course, the best way to get to know the differences between tequila and mezcal is to pick up a bottle of each from your Total Wine and More and pour hundreds of years of tradition right into your glass. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let's go to Bondi. 4 votes for nothing worse than Kash Patel, and we'll see what will happen. And I think actually, having spent a fair bit of time at the department, I can chart out exactly how the dangers might work. But Bondi, who you've described in fairly benign terms just now, Norm, she's not an outstanding candidate historically. She's the first AG in many years with no federal experience. But let's assume she's over the bar on paper. But the problem, of course, and you adverted to it, Jen, is her clear refusal to displease Trump and what that portends for her tenure. And the worst example to me was could not bring herself to choke out the words of a yes/no question. Did Trump lose the 2020 election? I've heard people say on your old station, Norm, CNN, saying, what are you going to expect? How else would they be nominated? But other controversial nominees in the past, Thomas, Kavanaugh, they answered the Senate's question, and there are 200 defendants still to process from January 6th. If you think the election was stolen, why would you, I think it will really matter. So I'm showing my colors more than a host should, but was her performance disqualifying?
There's no longer any such thing as a disqualifying performance. It's one of the signs of autocracy. It's why Jen left the Post. It was covered as if it was a genuine act when it was a piece of kabuki theater. The MAGA senators are no longer engaging in constitutional advice and consent. They have turned into knee benders, ring kissers, tuchas lechers for the Yiddish caucus among your listeners. I'll translate into the King's English, ass kissers. And somebody has to say that. The autocratic emperor has no clothes. The body politic is naked. Jim Acosta manages to do neutral journalism, to be very tough on Dems and Republicans and centrists alike, but to honestly acknowledge the real world we're living in, not to live in a pretend land. And that's what those hearings was. Well, she responded masterfully. She evaded. Jen?
I think this is emblematic of the fact that we have systematically lowered our standards. It is not okay to commit perjury on the stand, particularly when you are auditioning for Attorney General. She perjured herself. She knows very well when she said, I've never heard of these things, or I don't know what you're talking about. That's perjury, period. She knows those things. She's pretending she never heard them. Secondly, she is an election denier. That is disqualifying. You cannot have someone in public office who does not accept that the voters control. And that is unacceptable. And the fact that, as Norm said, the mainstream media said, oh, she was so poised. She did such a good job of fending off their, complaints. She really practiced at home is why I can't abide by them anymore.
That's exactly my view. 1,460 more days to go of the Trump-Vance administration. I just saw their official portraits, by the way. He's like glowering, like, he sat on a whoopee cushion. I found the last couple months since his election to be peppered with foreboding signs of his ambition for authoritarian rule that hardly anyone seems to care about. I thought we could or should just lay down some markers, notes that we'll put in the vault to look to on the distant other side if it comes. So, I open the floor to you three sages for just, general discussions of questions such as how the path ahead looks to you. Is it clear or murky? What about the strong possibility that Trump blunders and is foiled in that way? And then critically, what are likely to be the most effective checks on his power? We've talked about many normal institutions that seem like they won't be or not to their normal historical role.
I think it could be, in addition to being a very bumpy road for democracy, it could be a very rocky road for Trump politically. He's basically a chaos agent And that undercuts his ability to be a dictator because he's more of a bomb thrower than a dictator. And I think the form it's going to take is not legislation on the Hill. It's much easier to stop something than it is to get something through. And even on the House side, where there's no filibuster, their margins are very, very slim. And so, for instance, they just ticked off Mike Turner. They're not going to be able to count on him for votes on other issues. But the scary thing is executive orders. So on January 20th, you're going to have not 10, not 20, but I would guess dozens of executive orders. And it's going to be shock and awe, kind of a cluster bomb with so many different outrageous executive orders that we're going to have to get injunctions against. The anti-Trump part of the country is going to be thrown into disarray. And what it's going to be like, and this goes to, Jen, your comparisons with authoritarian regimes, it's going to be rule by decree. So I actually think that instead of calling them executive orders, some of these are going to be so outlandish that they should be called decrees, even though there is no legal standing for decrees.
That's one of the things that worked in Poland, John. They didn't maintain this false neutrality that benefits a would-be dictator in the press there. They actually, when the regime there started appointing judges, the headlines were fake judge appointed to real court. You can't allow the usurpation of language as part of the political conquest. That's why the four of us are doing the contrarian, because we want to have a place.
So rather than on January 20th, when we're covering all this, saying Donald Trump on his first day, when he said he would be a dictator for a day, he was telling the truth. He signed 75 executive orders, but actually they were not executive orders. He signed 75 illegal decrees on his first day in office.
Here's the problem. This is another thing that we're all going to have to get used to. I learned this from the autocracy experts that we interviewed all over the world for this democracy playbook at Brookings, and practitioners, scholars and practitioners. He's doing legalism. Many of them will be legal, but they're being pursued in order to dismantle. It's like the worm Ouroboros consuming his own tail. It's a parasite that gets within a healthy system and eats away from it within. And unlike the first term, he now has clever lawyers who know how to deploy the tools of the legal system, legalism, against the virtues and hollow it out from within. And that's why you've got to shout and, take a Valium when you listen to me.
Don't call all of them illegal, but when he says no more birthright citizenship,
well, that's nakedly illegal.
It's illegal.
Yes.
Final word of the week to this week's hero, Jen Rubin, who started it by resigning from the Washington Post. Your thoughts here?
Well, I think we are, in fact, at that inflection point. I think it's going to take courage. It's going to take stamina. And most importantly, it takes community. One of the things that worked in Poland was that the opposition did not cannibalize one another. They did not fight one another. They banded together, because unless there's unity among pro-democracy forces, you are already beat. And we're going to have to foster that sense of solidarity, community, support in order to get through this. And someone asked me the other day, forget what the issue was. Well, how can you believe in so-and-so? They're in favor of tax cuts. I don't care. I don't care what screwy past positions somebody took, if now they are on the side of democracy. And conversely, simply because you say that you are a Democrat, if you're now going to go down the road of capitulation, I don't care that you're in favor of things that on a policy basis I care about. I have become a one-issue voter, a one-issue person, and that is democracy, democracy, democracy.
And it's the issue of the day. Very quickly, I'll just say I think Norn's point is very important about exploiting the apparent levers of legalism. And the second thing is, I think we're seeing there'll be a lot of ways in which he'll do much less than promised, and people will say, see, you guys are panicking. But that is the nature of autocracy. If there's a single Kash Patel prosecution of a political enemy, I don't care what it is, that's the soul of autocracy. That's Putin's America. All right. 1 minute left for our final feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question, have to answer it in 5 words or fewer. And back to center stage, Pam Bondi. Fill in the blank. The best thing about Pam Bondi is 5 words or fewer.
She's not Matt Gaetz.
That was mine.
That was
Great
everybody's
minds.
thing.
That was mine.
You can do it. You can do it. Norm?
She's not that good at this law thing.
Yeah, that's actually, I went along the lines of Norm. It's a little nuanced for me at these last things, but she has no federal experience. That's the best. Guys, such a pleasure. You caught all 3 of you contrarians. I hope we'll be seeing you again and often. Thank you so much, Jonathan, Norm, and Jen. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, trying to break down the various threats out there to constitutional norms and the rule of law, now especially as we make our way into Trump 2.0. And you can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. And, saving the best for last perhaps, some big news to announce. Talking Feds is joining forces with the Contrarian, which you may have heard about, a bold new media venture committed to reviving the dedication to truth, the fight for democracy, and the diversity of opinion that feel increasingly rare in today's news landscape. Rest assured, it's still the same scrappy, independent Talking Feds you've come to know and trust, but now linked with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political history. Check out the Contrarian, including Talking Feds. You can just go to the Contrarian Substack. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahendranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.